Welcome back to the Dark Reading News Desk here at RSA 2025. Terry Sweeney with Dark Reading. Joining me now is Alex Weinert, Chief Product Officer with Semperis. Alex, welcome to the Dark Reading News Desk.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
We're used to seeing you at events like this with your Microsoft t-shirt on, not Semperis. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I spent, I guess, almost 30 years at Microsoft, and from about 2012, I built out the identity security team, which, it's a strange thing, but leaving in a really good spot. I had a really fantastic leadership team. I've been doing it for a long time. And I'm really proud of the work we've done around conditional access, multi-factor authentication, the security detections, and all the other things that people were relying on. And it was just an exciting time to kind of take a break and take a different tack.
Sure.
And give some room for those great leaders to take it up another level while they're still at Microsoft. So Semperis is a super fun company that's doing some really important work on very much the same mission around identity security, really focusing on what is practically where everybody is at, which is hybrid identity security.
Well, let's talk more about that. Can we start just by defining what hybrid identity security is?
Yeah, I think obviously coming from working on the security team for identity in Microsoft Entra, very focused on cloud identity. And lots of organizations are making that shift to cloud identity, and that's fantastic, whether it's Entra or whomever. But everyone has applications that are running on-prem, right? Everyone has that infrastructure that they're still dependent on. And in reality, basically every company is a hybrid company, right? Everybody's got an Active Directory footprint and a cloud identity footprint. Understanding how those connect to each other, understanding how to create a resilient story is central to creating organizational resilience. Like, practically speaking, if you lose the ability to sign in as an employee in an organization, you've lost the ability to work, right? And so that's really what we're all about, is organizational resilience, through making sure that that core infrastructure is protected, is secure, and then as well as making sure that you know how to walk yourself through a recovery.
Is that disconnect between the cloud and the Prem identity and authentication pieces what has basically allowed so many attackers to get the keys of the kingdom?
I mean, I'd say it's almost like the opposite. It's the connection between them.
Oh,
right?
no kidding.
So,
Okay.
In my previous role, we worked literally dozens of cases a week. And many of those cases were driven because on-premises identity infrastructure had been compromised and then used as a ladder up into the cloud. So for example, I've got my domain admins group, and they've got admin privileges in the cloud, and there's a synchronization rule that brings them across, right? That kind of a thing can create huge amounts of exposure. So once you compromise either side, you've compromised both sides. And then of course you're at zero, right? Mickey would say, this is like the CEO of Semperis would say, this is an extinction level event if you lost the ability to control both your cloud identity and your on-prem identity.
Is it possible to succinctly describe, like, by going hybrid, how you prevent or how you reduce the possibility of penetration on either side?
Yeah, I think you want to, I think the sort of the classic framework of identified, detect, prevent, respond. I think there's a big part of this, which I'm a big believer in, which is posture management, right? Understanding where those rules are. So, doing the inspection that lets you understand where the exposure is between an on-prem administrator and a cloud administrator. Okay. And winding those back so that you have a lesser chance of that happening. Having good detection to see if there's anomalies between what's happening in on-prem and cloud environments. Importantly, I think recovery. There's sadly, at the rate at which identities are attacked, my previous role, we tracked the number of password attacks. That number was over 12,000 a second last year.
Wow. Okay.
In just the Entra environment. And with that kind of attack rate and the kind of sophistication that attackers are demonstrating, we're kind of at a place where it may not be a whether, it's kind of a when.
Sure,
right?
of course.
So if you're thinking in terms of, okay, there will be a day when somebody makes a mistake, when some password gets leaked, when something happens, how do you set up ahead of time for that with making sure that you can roll back the state of the directory environment, making sure that you can, who to call, who to bring in, who are the stakeholders, like that whole preparedness piece is a really important part of it. And then you move on to detection and, stopping the bleeding or like containment, and then finally recovery. And that's really the kind of soup to nuts that, in terms of organizational resilience, that I think Semperis is about. And what attracted me to them is trying to solve that whole problem.
Thanks for that. So let's talk about where AI fits in there, augmenting the capabilities of hybrid identity security.
Yeah, of course. I mean, AI has been a key part of the identity security story for a long time in terms of building what are called classifiers that help you detect anomalous activity. Where generative AI or generative machine learning comes in and changes the rules in a lot of ways are that, and I think you have an attacker's lens on this and a defender's lens on this. The attacker's lens is really that it is now, even in a world where I could send a random message, like we did this test one time where we sent a random login request to 100 people with no prompt, like no reason, no context. This is back when we had simple approvals on the authenticator. And 1% of them said yes to signing in with no prompt, not even at their keyboards, right? With no context. So you have that, it's very, very easy for people to get phished. But when you bring generative into it, where I'm in an environment where I can say, I can put your company logo on that mail, I can make it look like it's coming from your boss, and I can use the same voicing and phrasing and maybe refer to a joke from an earlier part in the thread. And I can do that all at the speed of automation with generative. As an attacker, human dependency in this world becomes super, super dangerous. And so I think we're going to see massive surges in anywhere where a human can be convinced to do an action that lets an attacker in, you're gonna have a serious problem, which is why things like passkey are so important. On the defender side, the ability to understand and analyze huge amounts of data, simplify that down, condense that down to where it can be rapidly consumed by a defense team is super important, as well as allowing us to do some new classes of detection. So I think it is one of these things where I once said only robots can fight robots. Like, once you bring that technology to the game as an attacker, you'd better be bringing it to the game as a defender as well. So I think that it definitely changes the game. I think primarily any kind of socialing, phishing, and those kinds of things are going to become. It's going to become an imperative for people to essentially close off all the doors where a human decision can compromise the system.
Is there still a role for zero trust in all this?
I think zero trust is a framework that absolutely continues to play a significant part. I think getting zero trust right is challenging at the level that, I think there's a tendency to want to say, for example, I'm going to make sure that access to my mail is good and just stop, right? But then, okay, what about the directory that gives access to the mail? What about the servers that are hosting the directory that gives access to the mail? So you have to kind of work your way down and really think of it like, I once said it's more like you're trying to keep a ship afloat than it is that you're trying to build a wall, right? Okay. You have to think about anywhere there's a leak, you've got to deal with that. So, and again, where we see this is people apply really good zero trust principles to their cloud identity solution and they forget about their on-prem solution, right? Or they just assume, and this is not zero trust, this is implicit trust, which is the opposite, right? They assume that, for example, hey, my VPN's keeping everybody out of there, I'm not worried about it. Or I assume that there's no bad intent in the company or that nobody's got malware on their PCs. And of course, those assumptions aren't, that's sort of the antithesis of zero trust. So really thinking about how do I deterministically know what's happening in this environment? I think that's the center of it, and that's incredibly important in a world where, again, every human is now, a threat point, essentially.
All right. More recently, Semperis has launched a new cyber crisis resilience platform, ReadyOne. Tell us about what that brings to the marketplace.
Yeah, for me, this is really exciting. I'm brand new as the CPO for Semperis, and so cool thinking that I had nothing to do with from the team. But in my role at Microsoft, where we did with so much incident response at such high scale, really thinking about one of the things about incidents that's kind of cool and kind of hard is that it brings everybody together, right? The person who's administering the mail system has to come in, the logs have to come in, the logs have to come in from identity, the logs have to come in from the network, right? All these pieces have to come together. The hunt teams suddenly have to start working together. And they have to work together with the scrutiny of, the executive team or possibly the board, right? They have to do so in a world where content is, the council is involved to tell you what regulations you have to be involved in. And doing that in our team where we did that, literally dozens of times a week, right? We built a muscle and a toolkit for that. But most organizations don't have that, right? You're not getting that level of crisis on a weekly basis unless you're a fairly large organization. Having a toolkit that not only gives you a methodology, right, that lets you sort of say, okay, look, if you're in a crisis, this is how you handle it. This is how you get the teams together. These are the reviews you're going to need. This is the compliance stuff you're going to need. Here's how you know what was known at the point that that executive took that decision and which council said that was the right decision to take, right? Having that complete picture of how do you really run a crisis in a way that keeps you compliant, allows you to respond quickly to your customers, allows you to be prepared for it. And then having all that set up allows you to do tabletopping. You only can do well what you rehearse. I think this is super, super cool. Like if this tool had been available to my team back when we were starting, I think we would have like jumped at it as far as having a way to structure all that work as opposed to doing it all, ad hoc.
Great stuff, Alex. Really want to thank you for coming by the Dark Reading News Desk. You've given us a lot to think about where the future of identity management is concerned.
All right, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
We've been talking with Alex Weinert of Semperis. This has been Terry Sweeney for the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.